Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. And today we're going to be talking about US Nationals and what needs to be played. Jack unfortunately couldn't be here because it's actually tomorrow that Swiss starts. I thought it was on Saturday, but so it means I have to get it out a day earlier. So hopefully there's still time for you to test some ideas that I'm going to be chatting about. It should be good fun for you guys. So first of all, we're going to run down previous nationals that have occurred since Trump Card. I know we did a UK nationals one, but because Trump Card has now been banned, it completely rules out everything we talked about. So first off, we'll start with Canada. It's the most recent, and I think it's the most representative tournament we have. And it was won by Chase Maloney playing a metal deck with Aegislash, Heattrans. It also played at least one Mewtwo and at least one Seismitoad. And that's a really, really interesting deck. We'll get onto the decks more in detail in a minute, but that ended up winning Canada. And then also in the top four was two Raichu Bats decks. Oh no, one Raichu Bats, one Yveltal Bat deck, which again, very, very interesting. I really like it. We'll talk about that as well. And also a Landorus Garbodor Raichu was in the top four, which is actually my personal pick for US Nats, and I'll get onto that reasoning in a minute. So then we have Denmark. That was Groudon ended up winning, and Trev Gengar was second. I don't think Groudon is a strong play anymore. Too many things can just hit too quickly. Night March decks, the rise of popularity with Raichu Bats, just way too popular. I think Groudon was in a format where there was still some Toad around. Some people were still testing Toad. It was literally just after the ban, so it was kind of a fresh meta. And now, even though it's only been a couple of weeks, people are already establishing that Raichu Bats and Landy Bats are both really strong, hard-hitting decks. And Toad has really sunk off the map, other than Toad Bats. So Groudon's not going to be too useful anymore, I don't think. Maybe in a tech as a tech card in Donphan, but other than that, I just don't see it being that useful. Trev Gengar, however, the amount of fighting stuff around, Trev Gengar's still going to be good. Raichu Bats can beat it, definitely if it plays at least one teammates, it can beat that deck quite easily. And seeing as though Yveltal's sort of coming back in some popularity just for its resistance and the way it can beat Night March quite nicely, and how it can beat Trev Gengar, it just doesn't spell much good for Trev Gengar, to be honest. It's still a pretty strong play. I'd put it in my top maybe 6 decks to play. But at the moment, fighting is sort of creeping up again because... Dark is creeping up again as fighting is pretty high right now. Speaking of fighting decks, at Mexico, the tournament was won by a Donphan deck. And it was a Donphan deck that played Magnetic Storm. This is a very crucial thing. Magnetic Storm means that you can still hit Crobats and Golbats relatively easily and still knock out Zubats without any muscle band or strong energy support. All of this stuff, very, very helpful for Donphan decks, where otherwise, seeing as though there's so many bats around, basically, if you're going to US Nats, you have to expect bats in maybe, 40% of your games, at least. So having Magnetic Storm is huge for Donphan. I still quite like Donphan a bit. You can still place techs like Aegislash in your Donphan deck to really put a spanner in the works. But the fact is, it's always going to get Lysandered around a lot. And if they're using bats all the time, I mean, you can tech it to beat bats, I guess. You can just play Mime and all of this other stuff. And Aegislash is a great tech to have. So Donphan still can be useful, but without Magnetic Storm, you're not hitting enough into Crobats, and you have to expect a long game. Maybe a best of 3 would just be, you'd only have time for probably one game if it's Donphan versus their army of bats that they're going to face up against you. And I think Toad Bats is a difficult matchup for Donphan because under Trainer Lock, as well as all this other stuff, that all this extra bat damage, they can snipe you when they want to. And when they Lysander your Donphan, it's much more threatening. That Donphan does have a couple of bad matchups, but still pretty decent. And then Mexico's second place was Kling Klang Aegislash. So we saw Aegislash win in Canada just with the Bronzongs, not quite the Kling Klang line. But essentially we're seeing how effective Aegislash is at stopping almost every other deck right now. Toad, Raichu, Night March, even Landorus to some extent is really crippled by not being able to use its special energy to attack. I guess most Raichu decks play like 4 or 5 basic energy. I guess Landorus plays like 7 or so, but even that, it means that they're not even two-shotting Aegislashes because their numbers aren't as good. So we're seeing that Metal is definitely one of the top tier decks to look out for in US Nats, just based on these previous results. And the fact is that there wasn't even much support for Metal overall, and they've gone deep into tournaments. A second place and a first place for Metal decks, with Aegislash, and one of them has Kling Klang, which is like an absolute horrible lock for a lot of decks. I personally prefer the more streamlined, just the Bronzong, just have your text with Aegislash. But we are seeing the power of how Metal decks can win games. And then finally, Indonesia, there was Fairy Box that ended up winning. And I think it definitely would have had to have played Aegislash to do well. Again, we're seeing how Aegislash can just wall out decks to win games. Fairy Box also has the nice added bonus of being able to like outrun other decks in terms of energy attachments. You can use Regirock now to protect your energy. And you can also play stuff like Landorus for early game pressure. So you can try and make it difficult for other decks. And the second placement in Indonesia was Raichu Bats with Non-EX Yveltal. Again, we've seen Non-EX Yveltal. It was in the top 4 of Canada. It was actually all Yveltal and Bats, but someone played Raichu Bats with a few Yveltal in there to, again, help balance out the Trev Gengar matchup. It's also a decent attacker against Night March a lot of the time because it trades 1 for 1 very easily for 1 energy, and then if they decide to bring up Mew, then you can go into your Raichu. So it makes sense there to play it in the Raichu Bats deck. So let's those are the 4 tournaments that I want to talk about. Let's talk about an overall basis of sort of the field of decks that we're going to play against. And essentially it's a story of Bats being all over the place. I would say Raichu Bats is probably the number 1 hype deck to win the tournament. I believe Matthew Koo played Suicune and at least 1 Milk Tank in his deck, because essentially you need to have a few basic energy in there. You can tech it out how you would like. So there's some people playing it with grass energy, having a Virizion, potentially using an Exeggutor to try and slow people down and to help you against Toad, which is interesting. There's people playing Suicune to help you balance out against Landorus. There's people playing Leafeon as well, just as a big attacker, just in case you come up against a Primal maybe. Again, it's useful against Toad. Definitely now that people aren't playing Super Scoop Up builds. Like when I played at UK Nationals, I played Raichu Leafeon Bats. The Leafeon wasn't as helpful as I'd hoped because the amount of times that they're just going to pick up the damage back then because of Trump Card, it just made it useless. But now Leafeon is actually useful again because you're 2-shotting and they're like 4-shotting most of the time if you've developed your Virizion. So that's pretty good. Milk Tank as well. It's just a cheap, sneaky attack you can put in. And there's also, you can build it with Dark Energy, have Yveltals in there, the non-EXs, and maybe 1 Darkrai to help you retreat for your guys. So plenty of avenues for Raichu. I'm not sure which one's my favourite. Seeing as though you can probably expect a few mirror matches, I'd probably like to see just try and keep it as streamlined as possible. Maybe having like 1 Suicune and 1 Milk Tank could help out. Or you go for like 2 Yveltal, 1 Darkrai, 4 basic Dark. I'm not too big of a fan of Leafeon because I don't think Toad is going to be monstrously large. The one crucial tech that you need to play in your Raichu Bats deck is Mr. Mime. Mr. Mime should be played for a lot of people because if you don't play it, like in all your Bats decks, you want to have Mr. Mime because then against Landorus Bats, you're not going to lose because Landy Bats otherwise can kill your Bats much easier than you can kill theirs. And therefore they're going to outpower you in the end. And it's especially important for Raichu because you need at least 1 Golbat drop to actually one-shot Landorus's. So Mr. Mime is probably the most crucial card that I would suggest if you are playing Raichu Bats. So then we're going to talk about Landy Bats. Landy Bats still really strong. You can still play Hawluchas to try and kill Shaymins easily. You can still use Hawluchas to try and defend yourself against Seismitoad, which is slowly creeping back as Landorus Bats gets good. And essentially, you can just put counters all over the place. The one word of warning I would say, everyone's going to be aware of Landorus Bats. So most people at US Nats are either going to have cards like Toad to beat Landorus, or they're going to be playing Mime themselves. So it's probably realistic to think you might want to put at least one Lucario in, just to balance out maybe the Toad. It's an extra attacker you can use once Hawluchas have gone down. Lucario as well also hits free resistance with its first attack, and he has a more useful second attack, whereas Landorus is stuck with a 1 energy thing most of the time. So potentially putting one or two Lucario in could really help your matchup if you're playing as a Landorus Bats player. I still think it's a really good deck. It can obviously take on stuff like Night March, it can take on Donphan, it can take on Raichu Bats a lot. Definitely if they can't develop Mr. Mime. In my testing, the Raichu Bats player, if they are able to find Mime in the opening turns, like 2 or 3 turns, they're probably going to win. But if they don't, which is quite possible, Landorus Bats can definitely win because you can just knock out their Zubats for fun. And then outpower them because they can't one-hit you, which is really cool. So the next Bats deck is going to be the Yveltal Bats deck. I'm absolutely buzzing to test this deck out. I know that Nats has come up too quickly for me really to start profiling these decks, but in terms of looking at Worlds, this is going to be one I really want to test out. It was 4 regular Yveltal and an Absol, and then just Bats and lasers. You actually end up 2-shotting most EXs, sometimes even higher than that once you consider Bangle, Laser Bank, all of that stuff. The amount of bats you can drop in a turn, it's pretty crazy. I really like that. The typing's good, the resistance is good, plenty of good things about the Yveltal, and it's 130 HP, so your opponent actually has to commit a decent chunk just to one-shot you. My only hiccup would be sort of Raichu Bats. It's kind of a decent matchup, kind of not. I mean, you normally get the first hit, so you can try and kill Pikachus or whatever's in front of you early on. Depending on who goes first, it's very much a case of that. But it seems to me that Raichu really needs a lot less to one-hit your Yveltals than you need to one-hit their Raichus, because you need to go Yveltal plus Muscle Band plus a Bat Drop and a Laser with Verbank in play, whereas they just need a DCE. They don't even need Skyfield. So it looks like your bat damage is mainly going onto their active, whereas they have the option to start sniping elsewhere. It just depends on how you can manage your board to win that game. But otherwise, other than the Raichu Bats matchup, which is probably 50-50, I've not tested it enough, because like I said, you have continued energy acceleration, and you can excel onto an Absol as well to get a cool prize here or there. I would probably up it to 2. From the list that I saw from Team Fish Knuckles, I really think that the deck needs to play at least 2 Absol. It looks good to have Absol in there. Definitely helps you out against Raichu Bats. I'd try and find room for that if you're thinking about playing the Dark deck, which I actually really like. It's a lot less worried about stuff like Metal, which Raichu just pretty much loses to. You can see how Chase Maloney got through the field, because apparently it was chocker full of Raichu Bats, because it is probably the strongest deck. But Yveltal is a lot less worried about Metal decks. It's still not easy because it takes a lot to kill Aegislashes. They normally play Steel Shelter, so your damage is again capped. But the hitting 130, they're probably best off doing it with Heatrans. Once you get through that army of 1 or 2 Heatran, you're going to have a good game on your hands. Definitely if you can bat drop as well, and maybe snipe Bronzongs and stuff, slow down the development. I feel like Yveltal has a decent matchup against most things, so I would like to see a few people play that deck. Next up, still on the Bats hype, I'm going to talk about Wobbuffet Bats, like the original Bat deck that everyone has forgotten about, basically. I think this has somewhat decent matchups around the board. It's interesting. It can definitely beat a lot of decks. If you play Mime, you can beat Lando Bats. You can still face up to Toad Bats quite easily, because you're probably going to play 1 or 2 Fang Clubs anyway to try and keep developing. Wobbats is normally the one, Wobbats and Yveltal Bats, because they're so streamlined, they have a lot more space in their deck than Raichu and Landy, that you can get developed and set up really easily. You can get more bats on the field than most other decks in the opening turns. So Wobbats and Yveltal Bats are good against other bat players, just because they can have the option to go double Golbat to kill a Zubat straight away. Whereas they're sort of on the back foot a lot more often. They'll have just 1 Zubat on the bench a lot of the time if they're developing first turn. So Wobbats can be good against Raichu. I think that's the biggest issue, but again, you can't you have to factor in that we're stopping Shaman if we start up with Wobbuffet. That's really disruptive to a lot of decks. Slowing down their development is really cool. You still have a good like Night March matchup. You still have a good like Donphan matchup. You can pretty much face anything with Wobbats, which is quite interesting. It's not been talked about at all, and it's something that if you've got an hour before the game, before Nationals today, test out Wobbats. I think that's a fun option. And the final one I want to talk about is Manectric Bats. This is not playing the Mega, just going normal Manectric. And this is basically, in my mind, the anti-Bats bat deck. You just win out on the bat exchange, and then you try and win the game by you having yours, your opponent don't have theirs. So you can put more counters around the board. So of course Manectric can do the 20 and 20 snipe. This works perfectly with Golbat additional drops, and also you can play Wide Lens if you really want to. Just play like one or two of those, and you can one-shot Zubats, and also put counters on the active Pokemon. So if you play a Manectric Bats deck like you would play the Yveltal Bats deck, I think that could be really interesting. Like you could have Laser Bank, and your damage cap just skyrockets from there. You also have your second attack if you really need to, which is also useful for hitting bigger stuff. The only issue for Manectric Bats is Landy Bats, because essentially you're left just attacking with your Crobats once you've killed off a few of their bats and sacrificed like 2 prizes. You're pretty much stuck with your army of bats against that matchup. But everything else, I feel like you can out hit them in terms of your bats. Like you'll get more in play than your opponent does. So you benefit, you like reap the rewards. You can kill their Zubats early and then basically force them into a position where they can't bench another one the whole game unless they just want to give you free prizes. Maybe they have to wait a turn where they can bench like 2 at a time just to try and get one developed, which is like not going to win them a game at all. So Manectric Bats, that's another one I would like to look out for. Now let's talk about non-Bats decks. So that was, 6 lists just about Bats, and I've talked about techs, I've talked about all this other stuff. It's been a good few minutes, I think 15 or so minutes just talking about Bats there. But essentially, the reason why they're good, because it means stuff like Raichu can just increase their damage cap to kill EXs in a hit. Even Toad, like you don't need trainer support to one-shot Toads if you can drop a Golbat on them. And obviously against other decks like Night March that can only hit the face, they just can't keep up with damage because you can drop onto Joltix, you can drop onto Pumpkaboos quite easily with your bats and just win out that game. Even if they play Mime, there's nothing they can do to the bats. So I think that's why bats are good, basically. And like the reason why Landorus Bats is good is because then you counter other people playing bats, and you can also counter stuff like Pikachu and Raichu. So it's kind of a bat war at the moment in terms of U.S. Nationals, how it's shaping up. But here are a few other decks. So the first one I want to talk about is this deck that got top 4 in Canada, Landorus Garbodor, and I think this is really cool. You can have a really good matchup against Raichu bats because you stop their bat drops, of course, which means then they can't one-hit you, which is really amazing for Landorus. You shut down their Mime, so even if they play it, you can still snipe onto Pikachus, snipe onto other things, and really get good damage going there. You also shut down bats for everyone, so the mirror match is like pretty even. I guess you dedicate less slots in your deck than they do, if that makes sense, because they've got a 4-4-3 or a 3-3-2 at least in their deck, and you've got a 2-2 Garb with like 3 floatstones, so you gain space for other cards, maybe extra draw cards, or you can have cards like Headringer. Seeing as though it's Karina searchable, you can tech that into your deck, like just one, and try and find that to win out the Landorus matchup. The only issue for Landorus Garb is that its output itself is worse, because Landorus Bats has all the damage for the other matchups. But if you're using Garbodor, you're just stuck with Landorus doing the output, which is still like good enough against Night March, still good enough against Raichu Bats. It's not really good enough against like Yveltal Bats, because of course resistance. So then you end up having to throw in like a 2-2 Raichu count and a few DCEs. Or you could play a Leafeon as another attacker. And it does start to get quite clunky. But overall, I feel like a really well-built Landorus, Garbodor, and another attacker, like maybe Raichu. I think Raichu's probably the best. because you can run through bats if they're trying to stall on you, and you can run through Yveltals as well. And definitely if it's a Yveltal bat deck, which has cropped up now, if you're playing Garbodor, they can't one-hit you back. They have Laser plus Muscle Band, which gets them to 80. But of course, with Garbodor in play, they can't bat drop on you. So Raichu is going to take 2 prizes for its 1. Or you can retreat out and go into another one, whatever. So Landorus, Garbodor, Raichu is my personal pick for US Nats. If you guys are going, that's what I would play. Just make sure it's consistent and not too bad, because looking around the board, it can beat most bat decks. It will probably go down in prizes, and then you can develop Garbodor and start killing their other stuff. And you can also tech Focus Sash. If you're playing, if you're shutting down their bats, Focus Sash again becomes really, really powerful. So I'd probably tech Focus Sash, have a 2/2 Raichu count, 2/2 Garbodor. I haven't really tested out the list completely. I'd still have 1 or 2 Hawlucha just for Toad. So then you take on the Toad player with 2 or 3 Hawluchas and the 2/2 Raichu. You don't even need to develop Garbodor really in that matchup. You might not be able to just with the trainer lock, but against almost everything but Toad Bats, Landorus Garb is good. And the reason why I don't think Toad Bats will do well is because Metal is good, and Metal beats Seismitoad way too easily. Steel Shelter covers it. The bat damage is never going to do enough to Aegislash. It can always run through them. Heatrams one-shot Crobats perfectly with their second attack. And of course Toad isn't Quaking Punching. If it's not doing it turn 1, it's already bad. And because they can't DCE, or they just do it without any damage, and you really don't care, you can still develop as the Metal player just by single attaching until you're ready to go. So that's why I wouldn't play Toad Bats, even though it can sound quite good on paper. And if people are thinking the same logic I'm thinking, because Metal should be around, you should be in the clear as a Landorus player. So Landorus Garb, that's what I would play, guys. Next up, let's talk about Donphan Magnetic Storm. I did touch on it a bit earlier. The only techs I would probably play, wouldn't even play Sigilyph. I'd play 3 or 4 Robo, at least 1 Aegislash, probably 1 Wobbuffet. I think that would be it for techs, and 3 Hawlucha. That's all I would play, and make it consistent. That's all I can really say. Play Magnetic Storm. In terms of matchups, you can do well against most things. It depends on how well they hit their Lysanders most of the game, but that's just the nature of the Donphan deck. I think it can still really trade well against a lot of things, so it's one to look out for, I think. Next up, let's talk about Metal. Metal is amazing. I really like playing Metal. Going down the list of the ones I've discussed earlier, it's really good against Raichu Bats. And even, the reason why Aegislash is still really good, even though we've seen it win in Canada and come second in Mexico, is because Aegislash isn't easy to counter unless you want to fill your deck with, something completely new. Because, you could play a Leafeon, but then the Aegislash player never attaches too many to one-shot you. It's still a 2-shot into an Aegislash, and you're probably only playing a 2/2 Leafeon. You could play Suicune, I guess, but then they just go Heatran. You could play Miltank, it's just poking at them for some damage. You can play all of these other techs, but for the most part, Raichu can't attack, or you're waiting around a turn, and then all of a sudden you're so much slower, you go behind a prize at least. So I can really see it doing well, because they can switch in between their attackers so easily with Keldeo, and they're obviously getting Bronzong set up in almost every game, other than Landorus Garbodor, of course, which I would be playing. So pretty much it's allowed to do whatever it wants, and then with that much damage manipulation, sort of, in terms of Aegislash stopping a lot of your deck, and then you can move around attackers at will. Basically, you can drop a Mewtwo and attach 3 or 4 energy in a turn if you really want to, just to wipe out whatever's in front of you. It has a lot of options to it, so it's really good. And again, looking down the list, Raichu is crippled, Toad is crippled, Landorus is actually really crippled. It doesn't sound like it, but it means that you're missing 2 shots on Aegislash, which is obviously disgusting. You can 2-shot easily with the Aegislash. You can come in and hit good damage with Heatran. You can also play Toad and 2-shot them and lock them out of their development. And once they have a slowed down development, they only have Karina Search really available to them, unless they're drawing well still under the trainer lock and like grabbing supporters. So you can really slow them down just by teching like one Mewtwo, one Toad. You could go two Toad if you really want to go anti-Landy, which could be a thing you want to go down if you're playing Metal. My personal Metal deck, to tech against Landorus, I'm playing the Stadium that prevents damage to the bench. I can't remember what it's called. I'll think about it in a minute. But that's what I'm playing 2 of those in my Metal deck, and I like that more than Steel Shelter. I play 1 Steel Shelter and 2 of this other Stadium that I can't remember the name of. That's how I beat Landorus, and I just play 1 Toad. But as a Metal deck, that would be something I go for. Again, you don't have to get super crazy with it. Have like a couple of battle compressors to get maybe your techie supporters. I think in my deck, my tech supporters are like 1 AZ, 1 Colrus. Yeah, and you can just dump that with compressor, so you can VS Seeker into it quite easily. You get those metals in the discard pile. You can get maybe 1 or 2 of your techs that you don't like into your discard pile for that matchup. And of course, no trump card, so it's never going to get back into the deck. So you can thin yourself out quite nicely with a battle compressor engine. And your development is just really easy. Just have a 3/3 Bronzong is all you need. Like 2 Aegislash, 2 Heatran, 1 or 2 Toad, 1 Mewtwo, 1 Dialga. I think that's all you need. Then you just need 1 Keldeo, like a couple of Floatstone, a couple of Muscle Band, and then just make it consistent from there. Like max out the Ultra Ball, max out the VS Seeker, nothing too fancy. Like 10 energy, 3 DC, 7 metal, something like that. That sounds about right to me. There's not too many tricks for metal. It's just in a perfect meta game for it right now. Even though people are going to be on high alert for it, because it's been winning and did obviously well at Canada, it's not that easy to beat it. So it's still a great play. Next up is Night March. It's not made the top cut of, or it's not made the final of any of these events. I don't know if it top cut any of them. Because of the amount of bats, I would honestly go against anyone playing Night March. That being said, it can still like grind out wins. It's just quick enough to do so. If you get the first hit on things, you can just outprize trade them, get a Lysander on a Shaman to close out games early, stuff like that. Night March can still win against a lot of decks. I just wouldn't play it with the amount of bats right now. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's just a glaring weakness of the deck that you can't really get around unless you like don't bench Joltix your whole game. And like whenever you see a bat, never bench a Joltik, and you have to rely on Mew always getting DCE, which I guess it kind of does anyway. But it just makes your whole matchup a bit more risky. And the Pumpkaboos are still going to get targeted anyway. And always using Mew is bad against stuff like Raichu, because they'll trade 2 for 1 on you anyway. So Night March doesn't sound good to me at all. But it's still in there that can still grind out wins just because it's Night March and it's fast. If anyone's trying to be clever and develop too much of their board, stuff like Manectric, Toad, Garbodor, stuff like that, that can really get hit hard by Night March. And really surprise people. Whoever's trying to develop too much to try and win a game, like a Fairy Box deck, it's an absolute nightmare to go up against Night March. They're way too slow for that sort of deck. So it could still, if it hits the right matchups, it can still find its way into top cut. I can just never see it winning because you'll have to run into bats at some point. Next up, Trev Gengar. I think Trev Gengar is still quite good. The amount of Yveltal coming around is sort of scary. Like, Yveltal is probably, if I wasn't playing Landorus Garb, Raichu, I would probably play the Yveltal Bats because that sounds like a lot of fun. Potentially even Manectric Bats if I was that brave, but I think fighting is still going to be in too high of a capacity to try that out. But Trev Gengar, yeah, train locking stuff, stopping them doing things. Seeing as though everyone's trying to be turbo right now, Trevenant and Toad Bats are the only 2 around, and they're really not hyped that much. We only saw 1 trainer lock deck in those top 2 of all those decks, and that was in Denmark, a Trev Gengar, just the one doing well. So it indicates that it's obviously not the strongest deck, but also it means that people aren't prepared for it. And when decks are trying to be as turbo as possible, people start skimping out on stuff like teammates just to throw in extra trainers mails to get as quick as possible. Then Trev Gengar can start coming back into the fold and do well there. So Trevenant's one to keep on the radar. I probably think this isn't the tournament for Trev Gengar. Just because Yveltal received a bit of hype, and I absolutely love that video from Canada. the top 4 player. Man, what a beast making that deck. Whoever made the deck, I remember he quoted someone else for actually giving him the idea of the deck. So whoever that guy was, he was a genius. Next up, Fairy Box. If you're going to play Fairy Box, play Metal. That's the only thing I'd say about Fairy Box. It's just a clunkier version of Metal. Essentially, you have enough sort of boxiness that you can get out of a Metal deck by playing Toad and Mewtwo and your other Metal attackers. You don't need many other things. Like, what Fairy Box gains via other attackers is not enough to warrant how slow it is compared to Bronzong. Like, the extra attackers you can get is like Manectric, Landorus, I guess, is really good, but relying on just 4 Rainbow means you're not actually going to get those like turn 1 Landoruses at all. Just based on how many, you'd probably just play the 1 or 2 Landorus, and then you've got so many other bench Pokemon that you normally wait just a turn to retreat whatever's active with Fairy Garden. So I wouldn't play Fairy Box, especially because Metal's coming back as well. Like, they can kill non-EX Xerneases and stuff easily. So you can't really develop your board in terms of energy too much. You can't really tech too much against other people's Metal decks. So Fairy Box, it's not for me. One that is actually really for me is Kyogre. So the video from Team Fish Knuckles, actually, I'm going to quote it a lot, that discussed the Yveltal Bats deck. I think he was a senior, also played Kyogre, and I really like the play of Kyogre. It can stay out of range of Raichu Crobat, like, for the most part, and also, just in general, you have Rough Seas to heal off Bat Drop, so your opponent has to wait for a turn when they can get a crazy turn of Bats, which can sometimes never happen, which is really good for you. You can play, like, a single Plasma Kyurem to snipe, to win out the Night March. You can also play a single Articuno. I really like playing Articuno in Kyogre, because then you have a decent Donphan matchup. You vastly improve your matchup against Landorus Bats because of that resistance and the Rough Seas heal that you get. It is awful for them to run through a Articuno. Even if you're only taking like 1 knockout, that's either 3 prizes on a Landorus thanks to the Delta Plus, or 2 prizes on a lower stage of a bat, and it can be easy to do. Like, you don't need to play anything fancy, you just play the 1 Articuno. Kyogre can also play Suicune, which can be a pain for a lot of things. And in general, just 240 HP, most decks aren't like equipped to hit that. Seeing as there's so many non-EXs, people are trying to just get cheap prizes and snipe damage, and having Rough Seas at your disposal really makes it difficult for them to handle such a big attacker. And of course, you're retaining your energy after you attack, so even if they do end up taking down the big dog, you've got some other attacker waiting in the wings, be it a Keldeo that can just finish off a non-EX quite easily, or just another Primal ready to go. Again, it's one of these decks, just build it consistently how you would build a Primal Kyogre deck. You don't even need 4 Mega Turbo, you need like 2 or 3 maximum. It's a pretty easy deck to get going, and it has like great matchups against anything fighting. It's really not bothered about Metal as well. This is a really important thing. Seeing as though Metal's hypes now for Canada, from Canada, some people will be picking it up and trying to learn how to play it in this next week for US Nats, and Primal Kyogre just does not give a damn about that deck. It can run through it easily. Aegislash is doing pitiful damage. Heatran's not doing enough because you can Rough Seas off. Dialga, they'd probably only play 1. That doesn't do enough. And you set up your knockouts on all of these guys so you can take 4 prizes in a turn if you Lysander. Although some of them will play Mime, some won't. Some Metal decks don't even need to bother about Mime, so or don't have the space even. So Kyogre can do huge work there, and your other techs can do the job as well. So Kyogre, that's another one that I'd like to play if it was me. Just how I scout the metagame, basically. I know I'm not really discussing the top decks, but that's just how I play. I like to sort of find niches to actually win tournaments in terms of the metagame. It's kind of riskier. I mean, if you're just trying to be a safe bet, play Raichu Bats. That's the best deck. Or Metal. But for my like outsider sort of picks, Kyogre's cool. Landorus Garb is cool, and what's the other one I've discussed? Yeah, Metal is cool actually. I would probably Metal's a nice one. Yveltal Bats, yeah, that's cool. So next up, you can play just how like I've discussed it with Kyogre. You could play Manectric with the Mega and have Rough Seas. It's slightly easier for these Bats decks to kill you because they just need a Bat Drop. But again, you're accelerating energy. You can still play Tex. Instead of playing the Articuno, you could play like the Zapdos. You can still play Mewtwo. You can play some good stuff there. I think if you're going to play one of the Megas, I would play Kyogre just because the extra 30 HP is huge with all this Bat Drops and stuff around. So that's another option. Manectric Toadgarb's another thing. When I discuss Manectric Bats, actually, I think that deck can be really good if you play like 2 Toad and like 4 DCE and maybe just a Mewtwo. Yeah, that'd be a fun one to play. But you could also play Manectric Toad with Garbodor. Having the Garbodor again shuts down the Bat options, so your Toads are surviving hits and stuff like that. You're getting extra damage in with Manectric, sniping other Zubats and stuff like that. So that's another option. I know Manectric Toad Bats has been played around with for a while. Manectric Toad Garb, sorry. And it can really slow down a few things. It's got decent type coverage against the Bats and against like Landoruses, so it works nicely. The final outsider pick I would like you guys to at least have a chuckle at is Medicham. This has been one I've been testing the week before last. I think it actually has decent matchups. It can beat Raichu Crobat quite nicely because like Meditites can kill Pikachus. Meditites can kill Raichus. Just for its attack for 20 damage, you can add that with Muscle Band Strong. And you have weakness. So that's hilarious. And then the Medicham itself, its second attack isn't affected by resistance, so you can still run through the bats quite easily. They're essentially forced into a situation where they give you a bat in the opening turns, or they go into a Shaman, and either they don't kill you that turn and like pick up their Shaman to deny prizes, or they retreat out for us to Lysander it later for 2 prizes. So that's pretty cool for us. Medicham, it can beat Landorus bats as well, as long as you're playing Mime. Basically, that's all you need. You can beat Landorus bats. Obviously, the new fighting resistor stuff, like the Yveltal bats, would be an awful matchup for you. It can beat anything Manectric. It's not too bothered about Aegislash. I think it can still scrape 2 shots. No, it can still scrape. Yeah, it can still scrape decent damage against those things, and it's non-EX itself, so you can play stuff like Teammates to try and stay as consistent as possible. So I think that's a fun deck. It can obviously beat Night March, like it swings twice each time, and you can play Focus Sash as well, which is cool. So that's another one I'd like you guys to just have a think about. And if anyone plays Medicham, please comment below. You are absolutely awesome. But basically, I've discussed a lot about these decks. And yeah, like I say, if I was going to Nats, I would be playing Landorus Garbodor with Raichu. Just because I think you can shut down everyone else's Mimes that they're obviously going to be playing. So Landorus can still do his thing nicely. It means you can trade against Raichu nicely, which I think is probably going to be the most popular deck, just based on the field right now. Also, Garbodor shuts down Aegislash, so you're not really affected there. You have your own Raichu to get through other people's techs, like if people are playing Yveltal Bats, Raichu can still run through that quite nicely. Definitely if Garbodor was developed, it makes it annoying for them to try and kill just the Raichu. So that's pretty cool. I'd also like to play Yveltal Bats. I think that's another great play. A complete non-EX deck, very difficult to run through, hitting 130 HP a turn just for the single prizes. Difficult for the amount of damage you can toss out. Definitely with late game Absols, you can do really nice damage with that. So that's another top pick for me. And also Kyogre. I think that's another outsider chance. But if you're going to Nats, of course, you want to play something consistent. You want to play something that can beat the rest of the field. And Raichu Crobat is probably one of those decks. It has bad matchups. Metal is probably its worst matchup. And that's going to be around. I would actually I'd put Metal at probably like my number 2 deck. Maybe even first. Metal's probably the best thing I would like to play, just because I've got a good build of Metal right now. So those would be 4 of my own personal choices to play. You guys comment down below what you guys are playing, what you feel like is going to be the 2 most popular decks. I would definitely say Raichu Bats is going to be one of the most popular. Probably Landy Bats at number 2. Potentially even Toad Bats sneaking in. Just to try and beat the other Bats players. So, and also the hype around Meta right now, that's probably going to be a top deck. So it'll be interesting to see what you guys think about the meta game, and how popular things are going to be, and how hopefully you followed my thought process for those random 4 picks that I chose. Not any of them being like too top tier right now. I guess Meta winning is kind of like an easy choice for me to make, but yeah, I don't think many of you would have thought that Kyogre, Yveltal Bats, or Landorus, Garbodor, or Raichu would be winning US Nats, but those would be my top picks if I was going to be playing in that tournament, which unfortunately I'm not. I will be tuning into the stream, so definitely excited to watch all of that stuff. And then it's on to chatting about Worlds, and the Worlds format, again, it's probably going to change by the time that rolls around in August, I think. Late August. So it should be a pretty good watch. I'm going to start going through the Bronzon deck later on this week. I'll also be looking at Yveltal Bats because I think that's a great play right now, and it's a lot of fun as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and I've been Joe from OmniPoke, and I will see you guys next time.